Good evening, everyone. Glad you could join us. Today is April 5th, 2021. It's 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, and you are joining Hopi Cooperative Extension tonight out from the Hopi Reservation. My name is Susan Sikekwaptiwa. I serve as Assistant Agent for the federally recognized Tribal Extension Program, one of the cooperative extension programs out of the U of A. I'm based out of the Hopi tribe up on the Hopi Reservation in northern Arizona. And we put this program together really to support the backyard chicken growers in our community. And if this was pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, we would have people from our community in-house seeing us face-to-face. But now that we're doing all our programming virtual, it's great because we get to offer this to you all wherever you come from and outside of our community, because I think that the information we're going to be offering is going to be very worthwhile. This is the third series of a program that we started back in March. So we started with housing and predator management. Poultry diseases was in April, or no, I'm sorry. Poultry diseases was tonight. We did housing and predator management. And then the first one we did in February, which was on housing and kind of chicken 101 information. And we'll have one more scheduled for next month, Monday, May 3rd, and that'll be on egg and food safety. So these are all, we're held on the first Monday of the month, and they're also all being recorded. So you can visit the extension website on the U of A page. We'll put that link into the chat at some point, several times throughout the evening. So you're welcome to go back and watch any one of the previous workshops if you missed any of them. Or if your internet is horrible tonight, like somebody said, then you can go back and watch it later. We're going to record these and put this up on the website. So glad you could join us. I am just your host tonight and a facilitator at the end with questions and answers. We are going to turn the time over to Miss Ashley Wright. She's the extension specialist who is teaching tonight. And because it is a kind of a Zoom workshop, which is hard to interact with, we're going to just let Ashley teach for this first hour, share all her information, but go ahead and enter any questions you have in the chat, and we'll save some time at the end of the last 30 minutes or so to answer your questions. So you can wait to ask them then, or you can put them in the chat as they come up during the presentation. So thank you very much for joining us. I will turn it over to Ashley.
Great, thanks Susan. Thanks guys for having me back. I see a lot of you that have been on before. Let me just get my slides shared here. All right, so welcome to Chicken Diseases. Today we have a lot of information to go over. I've tried to focus on some of the most common conditions and diseases that we're likely to see in our chickens. And I do have the little disclaimer here. I'm not a vet, and I'm only providing this information for informational purposes. It's not a substitute for having a vet, valid vet client-patient relationship. I really highly recommend that you find a vet before you need one and make sure that they know you and your chickens. I know for some of us that's really difficult, but just keep trying and try to find somebody because it really is important. I encourage you to use your own judgment, your own resources, and consult a veterinarian when necessary if you have a bird in distress. And as always, if we're using any products on our chickens, read and follow all of those label directions very carefully. That includes dosages and withdrawal times. Remember that we are ultimately consuming products from these animals, and we want to make sure that what we're feeding ourselves and our families is safe. And some products are not safe for use in food animals. So we need to be very cognizant of that fact when we're treating our animals with any product. And I'll talk about that as we go through some of these diseases and things like that. So now that that's done, let's get the number one most common question I get out of the way. And that question is, why aren't my chickens laying eggs? Okay, so we've got a few conditions here that we've already touched on. Number one, they could be too young. 18 to 22 weeks is when most pullets start laying their first eggs. So if they're under that, they probably just need a little more time. Number two, it's too hot. I see that very often in southern Arizona. When it gets really hot down here, feed intake really drops off. And the first thing that they do is they stop laying eggs to conserve that body energy for other things that they need to do, such as their own organ functions and that kind of stuff. That may not be as much of a problem for those of you up north, but it's certainly something we struggle with down here. Number 3, they could be molting. 1-ish times a year, usually in late summer, not necessarily their first year, but probably their second year laying. Almost every hen will go through what's called a molt. They will shed out all their old feathers and grow a whole new set. This is really energy intense. It takes a lot of requirements out of the hen in order to regrow all those beautiful feathers. And most likely she will stop laying briefly during this time, a couple of weeks typically. Number 4, we touched on in our housing talk about lighting. 16 hours a day is ideal for egg production. As we start to drop into shorter days in those late fall, winter months, egg production will drop off, especially in our older hens. One way we can combat that is by adding lighting, supplemental lighting in, and we talked about that in our last one. So you can check out that video, and I believe we shared some links as well. Number 5, a hen could be broody, and that is a condition I'm going to talk about today because we have not talked about it. It's not a disease. It is a normal cycle, a normal thing, but it is something that happens, and it is a reason chickens will stop laying eggs. And finally, the reason we're all here today, they could be sick. And so that's what we're going to talk about mostly today. But let's talk about that broody hen. I get a lot of calls from new chicken people. You know, my hen is on the box. She won't get out of the nesting box. She won't go eat. She's not laying eggs. What is wrong with her? This is pretty normal. Basically, she has decided it's time to hatch some chicks, and she's trying to sit on eggs to hatch. Mostly this is most common in the springtime, but it really can happen at any time. Some breeds are much more prone to this than others. From what I understand, silkies are pretty prone to going broody. They will do it frequently. If you're not planning on having her actually hatch out some chicks, it's better to go ahead and put a stop to this as soon as you notice the behavior. What will happen is she will sit on that box for 23 hours a day. She will get off maybe once or twice to defecate, to drink, to eat, and then she's back on the box. So this is a couple of things. She's probably going to lose weight. She's probably not going to do well if it's super hot out because she's not drinking enough water, and she's hogging up a nesting box that somebody else could be using. And it's really not good for her. It will take her much longer to get back into egg production if you let this behavior continue. So the best way I found to stop this is what we affectionately call the broody jail. Get yourself a wire-bottomed bunny cage, dog kennel. I have a little wire-bottomed bunny cage that I use. It stays in the coop, in the shade, and she needs to go in the broody jail 3 to 5 days, sometimes as much as a week, usually 3 to 4 or 5 days usually does it. And what that does is, because she has no place to comfortably nest in there, it will stop that hormone cycle behavior that's telling her to sit on that nest and try to hatch those chicks. You'll know when she's ready to go when you let her out. She needs to stay in there 24/7. You don't let her out to go back in the coop at night. She'll just beeline right back for the nest box. You'll know she's broke of being broody when you let her out of there and she doesn't beeline straight for the box. She actually goes back to normal pecking behaviors and those sorts of things. I know it seems a little cruel. I don't like to do it, but it's much better than the alternative of the weight that she will lose and the condition she will lose. And how it's very unhealthy for her to be broody, especially if you're not going to let her go ahead and hatch chicks. Some other things that people have tried, I've heard dunking them in water. I haven't had any success with that. I know it's supposed to cool their breast area, that kind of thing, but I don't think that that's enough to really stop that hormone cycle super successfully and reliably. I find the broody jail to be the best way to do this. So now that we've got those out of the way, let's talk about some of these conditions and diseases. So I have, I think, 5 really common, what I'm going to call conditions. I'm not calling these diseases, I'm calling these conditions because they're just really things that sort of happen to the chicken other than the mites, lice, worms, and cocci, which are sort of parasitic type things. But let's start with that sour crop. So sour crop and impacted crop, which are very similar. And what this is the crop, which if you remember is that little pouch that sort of hangs right on the front of the chicken. It's part of their digestive tract. I mean, you can feel it. It kind of feels like maybe a baseball size, usually kind of soft. You can see in the evening when they've been eating, it's pretty full of feed. And what happens is as they eat, they sort of fill that crop up as a little holding chamber. And then it slowly empties into the rest of the digestive tract. And they sort of fill that thing throughout the day. And what happens with sour crop or impacted crop is it either gets infected, it gets some grossness going on in there. Usually it's a yeast or a bacteria, or if it gets impacted, it means that it's stuck and feed is not passing through like it should be. So how do you spot this? your chicken will be pretty lethargic. She won't be eating. You often will see them tank, what I call tanking water. They'll just be drinking a bunch of water, and then they'll have it like almost like they've overfilled and it's like running out their beak, and then they go immediately drink more water. That's usually a pretty decent indication that they have a problem going on. You'll also notice usually what'll happen is at night, they'll fill that crop up with the last feed of the day. By the next morning, that crop should be empty. It should have emptied all night overnight while they weren't eating. And so if you go out and check them first thing in the morning before they have sort of gotten up and gotten around to go eat, and that crop is still full, that's an indication that you probably have something going on. Sour crop is pretty easy to tell. You'll smell this pretty awful yeasty, infection-y, gross sort of smell, versus an impacted crop, if you feel it, it will feel very hard and sort of lumpy as opposed to the sort of soft squishy that it normally is. This can happen because of a change in feed. Somebody got a hold of a bunch of something they don't normally eat and it upset the bacteria in that crop. Or if they get a hold of a lot of super fibrous material like really long grasses, really long hay, straw. I've even seen them eat pieces of like baling twine that's been pulled apart. Like you can kind of see the baling twine in that picture there. And that gets balled up in there and doesn't pass through and causes a problem. So the best way to prevent this is if you're making changes to the chicken's diet, do it slowly. Don't provide large amounts of things that aren't their normal food at once. Keep amounts sort of small and spread out. Kind of keep the yard picked up of things like baling twine and things that they might decide to ingest because they're chickens and they do weird things. Definitely watch out for chickens that become what I call straw eaters. One of my favorite treats to give my chickens is to throw out a flake of Bermuda hay and sprinkle some mealworms underneath it and let them peck it apart. But occasionally I have run across a hen who for some reason decides that the hay is consumable, which chickens are not ruminant animals. They are not the kind of animal that really subsists off of grazing. So some chickens just take a penchant to wanting to do that stuff. So keep an eye out for that. And if you do have those types of chickens, make sure that they don't have access to straw or hay or things that are normally fine. And also ensure chickens have access to grit at all times. That just helps to keep the gizzard, which is like sort of the next little stomach section that actually grinds the food apart. That just sort of helps to keep everything moving through the digestive tract. In terms of treatments, there's not a whole lot that you can do without a vet. Some of the best things you can try to do, you can try to flush out the crop with some water. Especially if it's impacted, and clear everything out. That's a little tricky to do without, you want to make sure they don't aspirate things back into their lungs. There's some YouTube videos on how to do that. In extreme cases, crop surgery is actually fairly simple, not a super hard thing to do, but does maybe take some veterinary supervision to remove that impaction can be done. And you may need to get some antibiotics or antifungals on board to treat an infection. I would potentially call a vet on this. If it doesn't resolve in a couple of days, or if the chicken is in a lot of immediate distress, sometimes it will just resolve on its own too, and you can keep a close eye on it and let her sort of flush that crop out with some water. But something to definitely keep an eye on and be prepared to call the vet within a couple of days. The next thing is egg bound. This is a condition that happens to our laying hens where that egg gets sort of lodged in the oviduct in the reproductive tract. And gets basically stuck. This is a pretty life-threatening emergency for a hen. If she doesn't pass that egg within 24 to 48 hours, this does not look good for her. How you can spot it, you'll have chickens that loss of appetite. They'll be very sort of droopy, decreased activity, and they get this really, they call it the penguin-like squatty stance, where they'll sort of sit up like a penguin does. Once you've seen it once, you'll know exactly what it is. And you'll see them kind of straining like they're trying to lay an egg or maybe trying to defecate, but nothing's really coming out because the egg is probably blocking the cloaca and she just can't get anything out, but she's trying because the egg is there. And oftentimes you can actually feel that egg right there. So why this happens, a few reasons this could happen. Calcium deficiency can really cause this. Obesity, if you have hens that are maybe getting a few too many extra treats, that can cause this. Stress, if she chooses not to go lay an egg because there's predators around, or maybe she's fighting with the other dominant hens over their favorite nesting box and she just can't get in there to lay. If she's having excessively large or misshapen eggs, double yolkers tend to be prone to this. Chickens that tend to lay double yolk eggs Or if you have a premature layer, that's a hen that has started laying eggs before her body's really mature and ready. So we talked about those lighting schedules for raising pullets, I think in the housing one as well. And that's part of the reason that this is very important. We don't want them to start laying before they really should be laying, just because they're going to be more prone to issues like this. So how do we stop this from happening? Raising those pullets properly, making sure we're providing good nutrition in the form of a lay pellet, a lay crumble, or something like that. Providing free choice oyster shell or another calcium source. Oyster shell is really sort of the gold standard, and it's pretty cheap. You can get a 50-pound bag super cheap, and it'll last a long time. Make sure you're watching those treats, that you aren't giving them so many that they're becoming obese, and ensure there's enough nest boxes to go around and try to minimize stress. So as I mentioned, this is kind of a life-threatening one. This is one where you're going to want to sort of have the vet on standby and be ready. Some things that I have heard that are successful to resolve this on your own would be to try a little KY jelly around her vent area to just sort of help lubricate everything. A vet would provide IV calcium. I have heard of people providing crushed up calcium, like in the form of crushed Tums, like plain Tums, which is just calcium, in a syringe to her. And then maybe a little soak, warm water soak, and Epsom salts. There's not a lot of evidence to support that 100% will help, but I don't think it's something that certainly can't hurt to have her just sort of sit in a little warm Epsom salt bath for a while to just sort of help her relax and get things moving sometimes. You can do some gentle external manipulation. You can sort of hold the chicken, kind of cup her like this, and you can find that egg usually. Be very, very gentle if you're trying to help that egg along. One thing you don't want to do is break that egg. We would like it to come out whole, intact, with no broken pieces or anything like that, if at all possible. So be very gentle if you choose to try that. Finally, the last ditch effort of nothing else is working is to use a syringe to go in through her vent, find the egg, and actually aspirate the contents of the egg out, basically just suck out the yolk and the white, so that you can gently sort of crush that egg in and extract everything out. It's a little touch and go. You don't want, you want to try to keep the membranes intact so that you get all the pieces sort of in one go and with as few jagged edges as possible, if that makes sense. I would probably try to contact a vet and get some help before I got to that point, but that's what some people have done to resolve this. So moving on to the next one, we're going to get into some of these parasites now. So mice and lice I've sort of lumped together just because they're pretty similar. Basically, this is an infestation with external parasites. Northern fowl mites are pretty common. Scaly leg mites and lice are the most common things that we see. So we actually have a really good publication, and there's a link to it. And maybe Yvonne, if you get a chance, could throw that in the chat for us. Protecting your flocks from external parasites, mites, and lice. Actually, I just realized you might not be able to pull it off my slide, so we'll make sure it gets sent out to you when we're done with this. I have a few other links too. This was a couple of our integrated pest management and entomologists that actually work here at the UBay. They did a really great job with this publication about talking about treating these things in chickens. So how we can spot that we probably have a problem going on. If we see a lot of dirty vent feathers, if we see some decreased activity, their combs will get really pale. Remember, these critters are actually feasting on their blood, right? Like they're literally sucking the life out of these chickens. And probably won't get to pale comb until they've got a really heavy infestation, but that could happen. They'll start to look a little ragged sometimes. You'll see some feather plucking. And if you look really closely, and you should be checking your chickens over fairly regularly for this, you can part their feathers and look down at the base. And you can actually spot the little 6 or 8 legged critters running around, and then little eggs sort of stuck to the base of the feathers. And once you've identified that you've got a problem, we can treat this. They're actually very treatable over the counter. But why it happens, sometimes it's cleanliness. Just is our coop a little overcrowded? Are we not sweeping out feathers, especially during molting season, that sort of thing? Making sure that these chickens have access to a place to dust bathe is really, really crucial. That's one of the ways that they help to keep their own. I know it seems counterintuitive that they're going to bathe in dirt and they're going to be cleaner, but that's actually how they condition their own feathers to keep these sorts of things off. And also wild birds can carry these and introduce them into your flock. So if you have the ability to exclude wild birds from your coop and run, that would be really critical. And we're going to touch on that at the end, really heavy when we get to biosecurity about the wild birds. There's a few other diseases that they can bring in. Diatomaceous earth is something I see recommended a lot. I do not personally recommend it. People say put it in the bathing areas or put it on your chickens. I know it's a natural product. The problem with it is that those little sharp edges, it's little ground up. I can't remember what they are, but they're little ground up mineral things. I can't remember the name of them right now. It's escaping me. But if you look at them really closely in a microscope, they have some really sharp edges. That product is very drying. And if you breathe it in, it's actually a respiratory irritant, which is right on the bag. So I don't recommend that just because bird lungs in particular are super, super prone to problems with respiratory issues. I just don't see the benefit when we have other products that really work just as well that don't have that potential for being such a respiratory irritant to them. So I recommend using a product labeled for poultry. Make sure it's labeled for poultry. There's several options. Garden and poultry dust, which is a permethrin product. Elector PSP is another really good one. You want to treat the birds. You're also going to need to treat your coop and run. And you're probably going to need to repeat the treatment in a couple of weeks, just sort of to get the second wave that may have been eggs or missed during the first treatment. If you're using a dust, the best thing to do is to put it in pantyhose and go out at night when your chickens are on their roosts and they're not, they won't run away from you, and pick up each bird and use that little pantyhose in the little thing, like a little dust sack. And it really makes it easy to sort of get up in the feathers. You especially want to make sure you dust up around the vent, dust up underneath the wings, those sorts of areas where mites really like to hide. So, and then if you're using something like, I think the Elector PSP is actually a liquid. And that one, I don't believe you treat the birds, I believe you just treat the facility. And it's a little expensive. I think it's like $130 for a bottle, but the bottle is a concentrate, so it goes a really long way. You could split it with other people if you wanted to. And then I would get one of those pump sprays like you would spray herbicide with, get a new one and label it so it doesn't get mixed up with the herbicide one. You can mix it right in that, and you can super easily treat all your facilities really quickly with that product. And it does a really great job of controlling these types of things, and it's very safe. The only caution I have with those is if you use a product that's permethrin based. The Elector PSP is not, it's a spinosad. But if you use an permethrin based product and you have cats, just be very cautious you don't drag it back into the house, because that is a toxic product to cats. But again, that goes back, any product that you've chosen, Dust On is a really popular one. Just make sure that you're reading those label directions and following them for any withdrawal times and those sorts of things. Elector PSP has no withdrawal times for eggs. For those who don't know, withdrawal time is the time between the last treatment that you've provided and when you can safely start consuming those eggs again. So there's no withdrawal time, so you can continue to eat the eggs and that sort of thing. But again, always follow those label directions. And this article here on the last page, if you check it out, it does have some recommendations on some different products that you can try. So worms, these are internal parasites, essentially. We often see gapeworm, cecal worms, roundworms, and tapeworms being the most common ones. Sometimes you can actually spot them in droppings. As you can see, I promise it's not a headless chicken, it's just a badly cropped photo. The dirty vent feathers, the sort of ragged looking, that they'll sort of do poorly. If they have gapeworm, they'll do this like head neck sort of stretch gape sort of move. Once you've seen it once, you'll know what it is. Most chickens always have some worm load. It's not typically a problem if it's a very small worm load. That's actually fairly normal. We don't really worry about that. What we worry about is chickens that get overloaded with worms, where to the point where they are sucking some of the nutrients out and they're becoming a problem. They could become an intestinal blockage or that sort of thing going on. So we typically see that become an issue if the bird becomes sick for some other reason. The worms will sort of see an opportunity to take over. If we have a problem with poor nutrition, if we're having stress, if we have a really crowded or really dirty coop where the droppings are sort of everywhere, because that's sort of how everything is spread, especially if they're contaminating their feed and water and it's not getting cleaned regularly. That's how we can see these things sort of perpetuate throughout the flock. So our way to prevent this is good nutrition, cleanliness, healthy birds, those sorts of things. We can easily ID which worms we have through a fecal float exam. Most vets can do it. It's usually a pretty nominal fee. I think my vet charges like 12 bucks. Collect the poop samples, take them in, drop them off, and they'll call you back that day or the next day and tell you what you have. And you want to target treat the worm that's your problem. And you want to treat all the hens in the flock and repeat in 1 to 2 weeks. Now, here's the tough part about treating for worms in the United States. And this is one of the few times I'm going to send you to, the Chicken Chick does a really great job with her blog, and I'm going to send you to her blog because she's worked with a vet on some of the dosages and products that are available in the United States to use, because the problem with worms is we have all these products approved for horses and cattle and everything. None of them are FDA approved for use in chickens, in poultry, which means that technically we're using them off label, which is technically not allowed. And the reason for that is that there's no established withdrawal time for the eggs. And so we technically don't know how long we're supposed to wait before we can consume eggs again. Now, what I'm going to tell you before I move on is that flubendazole and fenbendazole, which is Safeguard, is approved in the United Kingdom with no egg withdrawal time. So let's talk about coccidiosis. We see this a lot in chicks because they have not developed any immunity to it. It's, again, just like worms, this is a parasite that our birds can get. Most adult birds carry some level of cocci. They have an immunity built up to it because they've been exposed to it. We see a lot of problems in our young chicks, and we could see a problem if we get a nutritional overload or a nutritional problem and we get an overload in our adult birds because they're sick or crowded or things like that. So with this one, we see a lot of abnormal droppings. Typically, bloody diarrhea is a big indicator that that's what we've got. We'll see lethargy, pale, listless, weight loss. In our chicks, they'll get that failure to thrive and grow. They'll just sort of stagnate. They won't really be growing every day. This can be introduced by wild birds. It also carries very well on like your shoes. If you're going back and forth with somebody else's flock, you could be carrying it back and forth. So just be very cautious. This is an easy one to take care of though. Good nutrition, a clean, dry brooder. I think we talked about that in our first webinar when we talked about nutrition and setting up your chick brooder and sort of raising chicks to be laying hens. That clean, dry brooder is really key. Practicing good biosecurity. I have a few slides on that at the end where I want to talk a little bit about what is biosecurity. And treatment. So day-old chicks can be vaccinated. You can get them vaccinated from the hatchery. You can also choose to feed chick starter that is medicated. The medication is amprolium, which is a coccidiostat. There's no withdrawal times or anything on that. It is a perfectly safe product to feed. If you want to, you don't have to. You can also have a fecal float test done by a vet to diagnose if you think you have a cocci problem. And if you do need to treat adult hens, or you don't want to feed medicated chick star, but you need to treat or whatever, they do sell it just by itself as a medication. It can either be diluted and given in water or given orally with a syringe. As with anything else, just follow those label directions for dosage. It'll probably be based on the weight or the number of birds. If you do provide it in the drinking water, you'll need to make sure that's their only drinking water source during that time so that you make sure that they're getting the right amount. And this product will cause some vitamin deficiencies, especially B1. So it is advised to provide Nutridrench or a similar product while you're treating with amprolium to just help those birds do a little bit better. So we've covered those, was that 5 conditions? Let's talk now. I've got 4 major diseases of chickens I want to talk about. I want to talk about Marek's. I want to talk about Newcastle, Fowl Poxs, and then just infectious bronchitis, sort of respiratory type stuff, most of it. Some of these are preventable with vaccines. So let's start with Marek's. This is a chicken herpes virus. There are a lot of herpes viruses for horses, for people, for everything else. And one of the things that they all have in common is that once you are infected with it for life. It doesn't just go away. It may not always cause problems, but it will always be there. So how we sort of spot Marek's, there's several strains that present a little bit differently. Some of them present with ocularly, they'll get these sort of irregular pupils and vision impairment. Some of them cause tumors. So you'll see paralysis, tremors, you may see weight loss, you may see irregular pupils. The death loss depends on the strain. This is a really popular disease. I know, we hear about it, we think it's big and scary and that it doesn't happen all that often, but it's actually a very common disease. This is a very hardy virus. It lives in the environment. It's spread through the chicken dander. So dander is just like the dead skin cells and stuff that we sort of normally produce and that chickens sort of normally produce. So it's not even like this is shed only through secretions or anything like that. It sort of just exists. And once it's in your coop, it will actually live in that coop for months or years, even if all the birds have been removed. And birds that have gotten Marek's and recovered can continue to shed the virus and make other birds who haven't been exposed yet sick. So a couple ways we can prevent this. If you're so inclined, if you're somebody whose birds travel a lot, vaccination from the hatchery, wherever you purchased from, is really key. That will be your best bet to prevent this from becoming a problem. If you maybe are more inclined to keep what's called a closed flock, maybe you don't necessarily travel to shows or exhibitions, you don't bring new chickens into your flock frequently, you may be fine with just some basic biosecurity type management. There's no treatment available because this is a virus. Some birds will recover, some birds will not. For example, the birds that get the ocular thing have been known to live for years and basically be fine other than some vision impairment. If they get the one that causes tumors and you're planning to consume them, that could be a problem, right? Because nobody wants to open up a bird carcass and find a bunch of tumors in the bird that they're planning to consume. If you are going to vaccinate, maybe you're a small producer yourself, you can purchase the vaccine in what they call individual vials of 1,000 doses, which is a lot of doses. So that's really hard for a small flock person to do. And it must be kept cold. It has some very specific handling instructions about once you've thawed it out, how quickly you need to use it and that sort of thing. So it's kind of a little bit of a logistically difficult one to vaccinate for, but it is possible if that works for you. We're going to go over some of the biosecurity stuff at the end altogether. So you're going to see that on several of these, biosecurity and flock management. Don't worry, we're going to cover that too. Okay. So Newcastle disease, also known as infectious bronchitis, and not to be confused with the other bronchitis I'm going to talk about at the end. This is a very specific type of bronchitis. So this is a viral infection spread through droppings and secretions. You'll see coughing, sneezing, nasal discharge, that greenish diarrhea, thin-shelled and fewer eggs, they'll be sort of just droopy, lethargic type birds. You could even see paralysis and sudden death. So this is a virus that they've had a big problem with an outbreak. They had an outbreak of this in California in 2018, I think it was. So the thing with this virus is it's carried by wild birds and they sort of act as a reservoir. So it exists in the wild bird population. So this is just another reason to try to exclude wild birds from your coop and run as much as possible. We really need to be vigilant about this one. Not only can it cause your entire flock not to either die or be depopulated if it turns out that you have virulent Newcastle, also known as exotic Newcastle. We don't want to be the carriers or the reservoirs for this virus that then gets into our commercial poultry industry and decimates our commercial poultry industry. They are very worried about this virus, as they should be. And so we need to be worried about it as well, just because we don't want to be the reservoir, because our birds are more likely to be exposed to wild birds and more likely to pick up this disease that way. Whereas commercial flocks tend to be housed indoors for this reason of being able to keep a little tighter control on the biosecurity, but it could still get into some of those. It could happen. An employee could track it in on their shoes from the car, that sort of thing. So we really need to watch. There is a vaccine available. It needs to be given between 14 and 21 days of age. It protects, there's a whole bunch of strains of this. It does not always protect against the virulent Newcastle, that virulent or exotic Newcastle strain. That strain, I believe in 2018, they figured out it was brought in by game birds, I think, that had been brought in from overseas, and that's how it got introduced. There were a lot of backyard chicken people in California that actually lost their entire flock trying to control this disease. The state veterinarian came in and said, that's it, and depopulated their entire flock. So that's something we don't want to have happen to us. I think we had a scare in Flagstaff at that time, if I remember correctly. So we really, really, really want to be vigilant about this. Good biosecurity is going to be key, preventing those wild birds. If you find sick or unusual bird deaths in wild birds in particular, report those to Game and Fish, get them checked out to see if it's Newcastle. If we are having an active outbreak in the state, because this is reportable, you can check on the website. Do not swap adult birds with anyone. Be extra vigilant about biosecurity in those cases. Don't loan equipment, all those sorts of things. This is just one we really need to be cautious with. So I want to talk too about fowl pox. So this is one that I see a lot of questions on. People, oh, I've got, is it, and sometimes it can be really hard to tell. So this particular chicken in this picture has what's called dry fowl pox. They get these little lesions sort of on all the unfeathered parts of their body. It's related to chicken pox. It's not the same as human chicken pox. Okay, you cannot get chicken pox from your birds if they have fowl pox, which is essentially chicken pox, but it's not human chicken pox. It's different. So you can't catch this. I forgot to mention on the other two, you can't catch either of the other Marek's or Newcastle. You can't get those either. So there's sort of two ways that this will present itself. Either painful sores on the chicken skin and non-feathered areas, they call that dry fowl pox, or they could actually get the lesions in their respiratory tract on the inside. That's called wet fowl pox. Now the wet one is much more problematic. It can interfere with the bird's eating, drinking, and respiratory and breathing. So as you can imagine, that's much more serious. The exposure happens through exposure to scabs, secretions, these open sores sort of things, and it passes rather slowly through a flock. So if you end up with a couple of birds with it, it will actually take it months to make its way through your entire flock, sort of a couple birds at a time. So you'll be dealing with this for some time. It's not super, super deadly unless they get the wet one. The thing about, there is a vaccine that you can give. They can either give them to day-old chicks, but you can also treat adult birds with it. So if you see signs of this coming up in your flock, if you've caught it before about 20% of your birds are infected, you can actually treat the rest and at least achieve some reasonable control of it a little bit faster. It's a pretty easy vaccine to give. So it's that's not a problem. It's a little hard to differentiate. I see people sometimes that it's hard to differentiate those lesions, especially these dry lesions like this. Is that fowl pox, or is she getting bullied and somebody has picked on her comb and wattle, and that's what's caused it? So it can be a little tricky to determine if that's what's going on. Again, good biosecurity can help with this, not bringing in chickens from outside sources. If we do get those chickens, we need to quarantine them and make sure they're not sick first. And I'm going to talk about that. And also this is passed through mosquitoes. Mosquitoes can transmit this back and forth between birds. So practicing really good mosquito control. I know this is Arizona and we don't think we have mosquitoes. We do have mosquitoes, especially at certain times of the year. Monsoon season in particular, it's warm. We're getting maybe some moisture every day, we hope. Some of those mosquitoes take very, very, very little amounts of water and very short amount of time to breed and reproduce. So we do have mosquitoes in Arizona, and they can transmit this from flock to flock. So we can keep those scabs kind of clean. You just use a little wound disinfecting solution to kind of keep those clean, put a little ointment on them to kind of soften them up. That's really just supportive care for those birds. We want to make sure we're cleaning that coop a little bit more regularly. The scabs and stuff are what really transmit this. So by trying to keep that stuff sort of cleaned up as best we can at least help prevent it from getting as far through the flock as quickly. One thing we do want to watch out for with this is what we call secondary infections, because they do have these little wounds going on. Some of our opportunistic bacteria and stuff can actually cause some problems here. And so we just want to keep a really close eye out for that and consult a vet that we may need some antibiotics to clear up any secondary infections. We used to be, just real quickly on antibiotics while we're here, it used to be we could buy a lot of the antibiotics we use over the counter. A lot of those have become really restricted now, and I suspect it won't be long before they all are, which is actually how California is now. Part of that is to try to combat antibiotic resistance. If we overuse antibiotics, what happens is, we maybe don't use it quite long enough, or we don't use quite the right one. We end up with bacteria that have become resistant to many of our antibiotics, and we don't have a whole lot of new ones in development. So we want to try to preserve that. And so one of the ways they've done that is by making most of our antibiotics prescription only, so that we can really have a veterinarian's oversight to make sure that we're treating the right thing with the right product, the right dosage for the right amount of time, to try to minimize that potential for increased antibiotic resistance. So that's why we can't buy some of those things over the counter anymore. So the last of the big diseases that I really want to talk about, this is the one I get the call about quite often. In fact, it's basically, this is avian coronavirus, okay? This is coronavirus. It's not the same one that we get, but it's the same family. It even makes the same little spike protein that our coronavirus makes. This one has been around for a long time. There's coronaviruses that infect cattle and poultry and all these other things. It's not the same one that we get though. But basically this is viral infection with that avian coronavirus. We see a lot of eye discharge. We'll see an inflammation sort of in the eye. They call it conjunctivitis. They'll have eye BPs going on, some nasal discharge and respiratory symptoms. The other thing we see that's super cool and kind of gives you a clue as to what you've got going on is you'll see these thin, wrinkled sort of eggshells happening in our laying hens. Excuse me. So what happens is these birds get exposed to the virus. Bird-to-bird contact will do it. Fomites, I'll talk a bit at the end about what fomites are, but it can be spread through like buckets, brushes, shoes, anything like that you're using to clean if you're sharing equipment. And then sometimes we'll see some secondary opportunistic infections with this. So there is a vaccine available, and it's pretty widely used in commercial laying operations, but there's several strains of this infection, of this coronavirus out there, and they sort of mutate all the time. And so it can be really difficult to get a vaccine that's truly effective against all of them. The best thing we can do is good biosecurity. This isn't super fatal. I mean, they say it's 100% what they call morbidity, which basically means that that's the number of animals that will get sick. And they say it's 100%, like every bird in your flock is going to get it, basically. But it's not super deadly. The big thing with it is it's very important that we need to differentiate it from things like Newcastle or Marek's. We need to make sure that it's really just this sort of normal infectious bronchitis thing and not something more serious going on. And we do occasionally see some of those secondary or opportunistic infections that will set in a bird that's sort of already down from that. They'll end up with pneumonia or a bacterial infection or something like that. This article that I've got the link there for from Penn State University is a really good resource for kind of reading a little bit more about this if you're interested. So those are the four, what I consider to be the biggest issue diseases that we need to be concerned with. And you'll notice there was a few things that all of those had in common, which is biosecurity. So biosecurity is really your best defense against illness in your flock. As you saw with some of these, vaccination is available, it's a possibility, but that's only part of biosecurity. So some key terms that we're going to talk about around biosecurity. Biosecurity is all the things that we do to prevent disease. It's vaccination, it's cleanliness, it's good management, it's good nutrition, it's preventing vectors from coming in. So it's preventing the pathogen from coming in, really. So a pathogen is any virus, bacteria, even a fungus that can cause disease. And that's what we really want to keep out, right? And specifically, this refers to things that cause disease. So there's plenty of other viruses that float around and bacteria that float around that are perfectly harmless. They don't cause disease. So we don't worry about them. We worry about the pathogenic ones. A vector is any living thing that can transmit disease. So that's flies, mosquitoes, people, pets, wild birds, rodents, anything like that that can transmit a disease from one animal to another. A fomite is an inanimate object. So buckets, shovels, feed bins, shoes, and tires are big ones that we see, especially in the commercial industry. They're super worried about that. You know, people driving from one facility to another, they'll often have disinfecting things for them to drive the vehicle through to get it off the tires to prevent it from coming in, because it comes in off the tires and then somebody walks through with their shoes and then walks into the birdhouse and bam, they've exposed it. So they're really on it about the fomites. When we talk about vaccination and immunization, basically what we're talking about, vaccination is what we do, that's giving the bird the vaccine. Immunization is what we want to happen, right? That's where the bird's immune system will respond to the vaccine. We basically taught their immune system to recognize, hey, that's a pathogen and that's bad, so that when they encounter it for real, when they really encounter the real disease, they don't actually get sick, or maybe they get less sick. And then finally, incubation period, that's the time between exposure to a pathogen and the development of the symptoms. And so that's really going to be key to determining how long we need to quarantine for. So if it's a 2-week incubation period, that means that there's 2 weeks where that bird could have been exposed and it's not showing signs yet of the disease, but it has it. Okay, and so that's going to be important to remember. This is the Khaleesi looking over her flock. So when we're talking about biosecurity, these are some of what I consider to be sort of the 5 biggest principles that are going to serve you well to put in practice in your flock. Number 1 is quarantine new arrivals. If you're bringing in birds, especially adult birds, from other sources, from other flocks, from shows, anywhere that you've purchased them, you should quarantine them when they come onto your place before you put them with your old birds, the birds you already had. And I have a whole slide on quarantine and what is good quarantine in just a second. Number 2, make sure you're always purchasing healthy looking birds from reputable breeders. There's a lot of backyard breeders that do a really great job. You'll know when you look at the birds, are they clean? Are they healthy? Are they vaccinated or not? And not is not a deal breaker. It's just something to note. Just making sure that those birds have clearly been well cared for and that they're practicing good biosecurity. They're not always swapping birds with other people without quarantining and things like that. Because they may be passing something on to you and they don't even know. It's not that they're doing it on purpose, they just don't know because they've been swapping birds. The NPIP is the National Poultry Improvement Plan. It's a voluntary plan. Arizona does administer it through the Arizona Department of Ag. And that's something that you can get involved with if you're interested in, and the really good hatcheries will be NPIP certified. The big national level hatcheries all are NPIP certified. And the goal with that is to make sure that the birds that they're producing and sending out are free from disease. That includes things like Salmonella and E. coli, which I didn't even talk about today, because they don't tend to affect the bird as much, except as maybe a secondary infection to some of these other things. But they are something that could be passed on to you through eggs and food safety. So I plan to talk a little more about that next time. But the NPIP plan helps to make sure that the birds that they're producing are free from those types of things. The other thing with biosecurity is good nutrition and management. Healthy birds that are kept in clean facilities with access to good feed and clean water are going to just do better. They're going to have a healthy, robust immune system and the ability to fight off these diseases if they are exposed to them. We want to minimize vectors. Remember, vectors are those living things. Flies, mosquitoes, rodents, wild birds in particular are a big one for us because poultry are also birds, and so many of those diseases are cross-contaminatable between wild bird populations and our domestic chickens. But also visiting humans. If you have other people coming to visit your flock that have birds of their own, just ask them, change your clothes and don't wear the same shoes you wear into your own barn when you come over. And the same thing, when they go back, they should change their clothes before they go back to their flock. Just some basic, easy things to make sure that we're not transmitting things back and forth. And finally, consider vaccination if it makes sense for you. Many of those vaccines are only available in 1,000-dose vials, which is really tough for small producers who want to take advantage of vaccination. But maybe there's some opportunities there that if some of you wanted to try to band together and purchase some of those things and use them sort of as a share, that might be an option that you guys could talk about. So when we talk about quarantining correctly, 30 days is ideal. That's sort of what we consider to be the normal gold standard, unless you suspect that those birds could have been exposed to something that has a longer incubation time. Like if there's something that has a 60-day incubation time or something like that, then you should wait that amount of time from the time that you bring them onto your property. While they're in quarantine on your property, they should have no contact with other birds. So no fence-to-fence contact. They need to be completely separated. Ideally, they would even be in a different building if that's at all possible. We definitely don't want to be sharing equipment back and forth. Remember, those fomites can be things like cleaning equipment, feeding buckets, those sorts of things. Have a separate set for each one. Care for those quarantine animals last. So go care for your original birds first, and then go quick care for the birds that are in quarantine, and then change your clothes, your shoes, and wash up if you're planning to go back to the non-quarantine birds. Always go from what we consider to be the clean birds to the maybe clean birds that are in quarantine and around. And again, control those potential vectors. Mosquitoes, flies, all those sorts of things can carry things back and forth, especially on the same property. So try your best to prevent those from having access. I know it's difficult because chickens are outside and that kind of thing. And actually, I finished up a little earlier than I thought.
Well, there's Ashley's email up on the last page, so you're welcome to reach out if there's anything that comes up after tonight. And Ashley, that's A Wright number 134, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so we'll put that in the chat if you have any questions.
And to mention about that too, we really want to keep an eye on that sour crop and impacted crop. If you have a bird who constantly gets it, they can get what's called pendulous crop. And we don't see it as often in our layers, but it does happen where that crop starts to actually sag down. And then because it's sort of sagged down and out of alignment with the rest, it doesn't empty properly. And that just sort of compounds the cycle of having impacted crop or sour crop, impacted crop, sour crop, because everything is sort of out of alignment and it's not emptying properly. So it's really important that we catch that early and kind of keep an eye on it so we don't get into a situation where it's constantly going.
I will say we did have a situation in our little flock when, I don't remember what you called it, that when the egg was stuck in the track.
Oh yeah, egg bound.
Egg bound, yes. And we didn't know what it was. It was sitting for a day, maybe at least a day, didn't move. It sat there, and I didn't quite know what was happening, and it eventually did pass. And we usually bury our chickens right away, and we put it aside, meaning to do it later, and we forgot all about it. So we actually found the carcass later, and that's how I knew that was egg bound, because the egg was still in the chicken.
The egg was still in there. Oh yeah, yeah. You can totally find it. You can just kind of feel up there, and you can find the eggshell, and you can tell that that's what's going on. And when they sit, they literally do. They sit. You know how like a penguin sits up? That they'll be sitting just like that, like a penguin. Here's a picture of that digestive tract. And so you can see the crop sits right here in the front, sort of off to their right a little bit. And it will just feel like a little squishy. I don't know if you guys remember those little jelly stress balls. That's kind of almost what it feels like normally. And then it'll get full of food, but then it should be emptying overnight down into the gizzard and into the rest of the digestive tract. But it's sort of a little holding vat right here, basically. But I had one that got infected one time from eating. That's how I knew about the Bermuda hay, was she was eating a bunch of Bermuda hay and she basically had a little wad of it right there. And I was able to get it flushed out. And then she felt a lot better.
Had a flock of 10, didn't notice any abnormal behavior. I went out to check for eggs. I found a little bit of blood spots on the shavings, and I'm like, something's up. So I started to look around, and I found her kind of behind our box, and she was dead. And she had blood from her vent area. So, and she was young. I mean, they had started laying eggs, but I'm guessing when she went to lay the egg, it just didn't come out, and it ended up killing her. Am I right?
Yeah, it sounds like if there was bleeding like that, what probably happened was that whatever she did, she broke that egg. And it ended up, that's one of the reasons we really want to try not to break it, because it can lacerate. And if it lacerated just right, it could cause maybe enough blood, probably wasn't enough blood for her to actually bleed to death, but it could easily cause sepsis or another infection in her blood, which could kill them pretty quickly. So that could very well be what happened, is that she just, through her straining, she managed to actually break that egg. Or if it was something like a really abnormally shaped one that was fragile, like maybe two that got like half stuck together or something. sometimes weirdness just happens and there's nothing you can do about it, but that's like probably what happened. I've been really lucky. I've never had an egg-bound one. But one of my friends just actually just had one down south in Sierra Vista and had to deal with it. But
So here's a chat statement. I have a hen that was always so clean and in the recent weeks has a dirty vent, but does not show any other symptoms or abnormal behavior. Would that be a concern to keep an eye on possible disease?
yeah, it is. So dirty vent could be a few things. I see some dirty vent happening in the summertime down here just because they're consuming a lot of extra water because it's hot and it has been warming up. And I don't know where you're at, if you're up north or down south. They'll get sort of a little runnier poop and that will lead to dirty vent. But as we saw also, that tends to be a symptom of either potentially worms, potentially a worm overload, or potentially things like lice or mites. So what I would urge you to do is to get out there maybe later this evening when it's dark and she's roosting, and take a flashlight with you and catch her up and look really closely with that flashlight down between all of her feathers, particularly along the undersides of her wings if you can get there, and look for any signs of those lice or mites or eggs or anything like that. And if that isn't it and it doesn't resolve on its own, you could consider getting a fecal float test done to see if she's got a worm overload going on that you might want to treat. Because that is one of the first symptoms that you'll see is a lot of those dirty vent feathers. And it's basically, a lot of times it's because there's a change in their droppings, in the consistency of their droppings, and things aren't coming out the way that they're supposed to. And you end up with those really dirty vent feathers.
And with our breed or our flock, we let them out and wander all over the place, while we're around the area. So, and I noticed they do a lot of their dirt baths. They like to find fresh, clean dirt. I don't know if that's an oxymoron, but they find other dirt other than from their coop.
Yes.
And they do a lot of baths while they're out of coop. So I think that might help too
Yeah, mine always beeline straight out for the horse pasture, and they go find a nice big pile of decomposing horse poop to dust bathe in. That seems to be their favorite. The other thing to keep an eye on with those dirty vent feathers, especially as we get into fly season, is you can get what's called fly strike. If those feathers get super matted in there, flies will hit that, lay their eggs, and it will actually start to invade tissue, and you will end up with maggot. It's super gross, super gross. Google it if you want some pictures. It's super gross. You'll end up with maggots in it's hard to take care of. You have to get in there and clean them all out and flush it out with solution. So if those feathers don't start to resolve, you can always give her a little bit of a bath and kind of clean them off a little bit. And I've even gone so far in a couple of particularly gross hens to go ahead and just trim a few of those feathers. Not ideal, but it does work if they're just too matted, just to clean everything up and prevent that from happening. I've had fly strike one time and it is not fun to deal with. It is not a pretty thing.
Yeah, the whole topic tonight is pretty gross, but that's part of what we have to go through.
I tried to keep the pictures pretty clean, but a few of those links have some good ones. I think the one I put in has some really good ones with the infectious bronchitis. One thing that can happen is you can get some hens that will get it, especially if they're pullets and they're not laying yet. They can become what's called false layers, where they really never the oviduct gets sort of infected, and so they're still ovulating, but nothing's making it down the oviduct, so they won't lay eggs. But they're still ovulating, so they get like this buildup of ovulated yolks in their abdomen. It's super weird and gross. I really encourage trying to control those wild birds. I think they're going to be a real problem for us, especially if we do end up with a Newcastle outbreak here, because they are going to be the vector that spreads it from one backyard flock to the next. So, try to set your coop up so that it's covered so that wild birds can't get in there. If you are into feeding the wild birds, I have found it to be helpful to feed them on the other side of my property. And then that way the wild birds go over to the easily accessed wild bird food and water and stay out of my chicken area, because it's not as easily accessible to them. And so I feel like that sort of helps. Especially just because we have so many wild birds and stuff here. So what I found to be the most successful method of integration is to come up with some sort of a way to either divide the pen or put a pen next to your existing chicken pen so that they can interact through the fence, and put the new chickens in the pen so that they can interact through the fence after you've done your 30-day quarantine. for a few weeks, and then you can go ahead and introduce them. They should be aware enough of each other that there should be only a few problems. I would try to do it if you let them free range at all. I would try to just let them all out to free range together so that they can sort of duke it out in a bigger space. And if you find that your one big white dominant chicken is being a bully, you can always pull her out and put her in that side pen while you let the other ones integrate for a while. And that will actually sort of knock her down the pecking order a peg or two when you put her back. And it should resolve all your problems fairly quickly. I had to do that one time. I had one hen that was really bullying all my other ones. And so I just pulled her out for a while. And when she came back in, it was like she was a brand new chicken and had brand new manners too. So that's what I would try.
So Rachel asks, do you have any suggestions for a biosecure liquid for tools or a natural solution for feet or tires?
Okay, so I don't know about natural. There's not a whole lot that's, the thing is just testing isn't really done, but I will tell you there's a few products you can use. Number one, good old bleach works wonderfully on a lot of things. Dilute it down. You can make a little foot bath out of just a little tray that you can walk through to disinfect your shoes. You can just get another, again, I love those little herbicide spray pump things. Just get another one, label it bleach only or your disinfectant of choice only. And you can use it to mist down your tires on your vehicle, that kind of thing. Do remember that you can't disinfect poop. So if you have like fecal matter, mud, anything like that, you need to wash that off first with a hose. And then you can go ahead and apply. Bleach is wonderful. It works great. If for some reason, chlorhexidine is another one that works really well. The brand name is Nolvasin, but Nolvasin is really expensive, but you can buy generic chlorhexidine much cheaper. It's the blue one, it's bright blue. That works really well in a lot of things as well. Those are probably the two I recommend the most, but even like an iodine solution or anything like that usually works. Again, just make sure you follow those label directions for, most of them are sold as a concentrate so that you know how much to dilute it to. And the same thing with bleach, it'll be a dilute solution. It doesn't need to be a full strength. You're very welcome. And bleach is cheap. That's the best thing about bleach, assuming you can buy it. I think you can buy it now. I think it's not sold out anymore.
I think so, yeah.
It takes about 3 weeks for an egg to hatch from start to finish. One thing you can do is and I don't have a really good slide on it, but if you can Google it, you can actually candle them.
Okay.
And there's some really good images online that'll show you if an egg is fertile and if there's a chick developing in it or not. And that will kind of maybe give you some clues as to if there's some that are still going to hatch that you want to leave in there. And you might maybe mark them with a Sharpie. And then if there's some that are either not developing or have died that you want to pull out, you can go ahead and do that. And then basically you're just going to have to pick a point and say, this is it. And you could just mark the eggs you intend to leave, and then every day just start picking up the ones that you don't anymore, the freshly laid ones. Does that make sense? The ones that I've marked are ones that have been here for a while and might still hatch, and then anything that's unmarked has been laid since this date, and I can pick them up and consume them. You know, once you bring them into room temperature or into the fridge, it'll stop any development, and it's perfectly fine to eat those fertile eggs as long as you're sort of picking them up the day that they're laid. So this could go on for quite a few months if you wanted to let it. What I think some people, and I don't raise chicks myself, so I'm not by any means an expert on this, but what a lot of people do is they actually just buy an egg incubator. And instead of letting the hens sit on them, they actually pick them up and put them in the egg incubator, where you have some more fine-tuned control over the temperature and the humidity and that sort of thing. So you'll be more successful with an incubator, but you could just let things continue as they are as well.
Yeah, the series was really set up for all of us who raise backyard chickens. It was really designed to look at raising hens for egg laying purposes. So, you know, we didn't cover much about meat birds, but maybe we'll do a series on that later. But this series really is just focusing on laying hens in your backyard. So we really hope you got some good information from it. And you'll join us next time when we do this again in about a month. So we're glad you joined us. You all have a great night. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ashley.